Today we're going to talk about the human resource management and payroll cycle. So in this chapter we're going to look at business processes related to the human resource and payroll cycle, key decisions that need to be made, and then threats and mitigation of those threats through good controls. So within the HRM process, we hire new employees, we assign training, assign them to jobs, compensate them through our payroll arm, evaluate performance, and then discharge employees, both voluntary and involuntary. For some of these, we need, like recruiting and hiring new employees, we need to have controls in place. That's what we're going to discuss toward the end of our conversation. Within the payroll cycle, the activities, and they work hand in hand with HR, although they're not really part of HR, but they work hand in hand. We update the payroll master file and master data. So this would be your permanent information, your name, address, phone number. So let's say you move, we want to update that, or if you got a raise, we want to update that. Obviously, we need some controls in place, separation of functions. We don't want you to update your own pay rate, right? And so we put user IDs, passwords in that only management, HR managers that have WRIT right authority are able to change anything in the payroll master file. The second one there, validate time and attendance data. That would be transaction file information. Source document is usually either timesheets, time cards, or we might use barcode technologies when we have electronic file for our timesheets. We'll then prepare the payroll register, which basically in aggregate for the company shows everyone how much everyone is paid, gross pay, net pay, and other deductions. If they have a number of deductions, we'll use what's called a deduction register. Then we'll disperse the payroll through the cashier. A good control to use would be direct deposit, and then we'll disperse taxes and deductions in a timely fashion to the IRS, lest we get penalty or extra interest that we don't want to pay. All right, so first three processes: update the master payroll file, validate time from the time cards or the electronic time cards, and then prepare the payroll register. All right, and so some threats that can occur: an unauthorized change to payroll master data. So someone wants to give themselves a raise. I talked about this a minute ago. How do we stop that from occurring? Separation of duties, and only the payroll the payroll, probably HR manager would have access to payroll master file, that permanent information for your name, address, pay rate, phone number. So if you move, only that HR manager or his, someone that he directed would be allowed to change that. Or if you got a pay rate, only that HR manager or his directive would be able to change that. So good access controls, user ID passwords, have the right person in there to make those changes. Okay, and then separate functions. I would also say probably we want to have someone look over that. So if the HR manager is having someone, an HR employee do that, the HR manager should look over, supervise, and look over and have reasonable assurance that those changes that were made are correct. If they're not correct, the employee, believe me, is going to complain. Inaccurate updating of master file data. We saw in QuickBooks, we used input controls. So if you recall, there's a completeness test. I'm not going to be able to get out of that master file unless I change all the boxes I'm supposed to. Name change, address, phone number, all those need to be filled. All right, so that we can have accurate updating and full accounting of that master data. Input control, we saw that as well for amounts. So we can use closed loop verification. So I put someone's social security number in, name should pop up, and the rate should pop up. And those are the names and rates that I should use in making my changes. So those are processing integrity controls, sometimes called input controls. See inaccurate time and attendance data. The payroll supervisor, department head, should look over all the time card data. Make sure that those hours are reasonable. So look at the budget for the week or schedule for the week and compare that with how many hours are worked by each employee. There should be a very low variance between number of hours scheduled and number of hours actually worked. So that would be a supervisory review. And then source data automation. So use for time cards, use badges, use barcode technology, which would make the updating of that information much more accurate. And then D, processing payroll. Um, Integrity controls would be things like batch totals. So I might have some batch totals for payroll process, say in an Excel file or on an adding machine. I would compare that with the amount processed by the payroll program. Supervisory review normally will be done by accounts payable. So accounts payable would look at that payroll file and again look at it for reasonableness. Are these the right amount of hours, the right amount of pay rate, and the amount that we're supposed to check, that we're supposed to write to payroll? Is that all correct? Disperse the payroll and then disperse payroll taxes. Some problems that can occur here: theft of fraudulent distribution of paychecks. So if we do paychecks by hand, paper checks, very few companies do that nowadays, but we need to restrict access to any blank checks that are written. This is a sort of antiquated way of doing checks. I realize a few companies may still do that. Most companies will use direct deposit, so that would be the control in that place. In that case, direct deposit. Second thing, though, that we do use is the Impress Fund. The Impress Payroll Fund is something that we can use to detect whether a fraud has occurred. So let's say for the week, payroll is $10,000. So I'll write a check for $10,000 instead of for the month for $40,000. I'll write for one $10,000 check for this week's payroll. So if there is an issue, if someone is, say, has a duplicate check, that check's going to bounce, or one check is going to bounce. I'm going to see that there is an issue, and so I'm going to then investigate that and see, oh, well, is there, I can use data analytics. Is there an aggregate or a duplication of a social security number that we accidentally, could have been by accident, paid someone twice. So an Impress Fund can allow us to detect payroll fraud or a payroll mistake as it occurs. It's not a prevention, though. It's really more for detection. Third threat, untimely payments. So we want to configure the system to make those automatic payments on time. So failure to make required payments, we want to make those on time. And so we have maybe a set time that I can program my machine or QuickBooks or program that I'm using. Okay, at December or end of the last day of the month at 1 o'clock, we send out the payroll checks or payroll taxes to the IRS, the withholding to the IRS. So we do that at the end of each month. So we configure it, and it's done automatically. It's done electronically. We don't have to do anything. We program it so it sends it out, that check out electronically. And so it will be, if it's a required payment that the IRS needs, they don't get it, they're going to fine us, and it needs to be timely. So that's 2 and 3. And then inaccurate payments, so same thing. We use batch totals and input controls to give us reasonable assurance that those payments are accurate, and then accounts payable would review the payroll accounts and payroll taxes and make sure those amounts have reasonable assurance that those amounts are adequate. We might decide to outsource a payroll to a company like Penmark, and this is just to reduce our costs, so cost of processing, minimizing errors, and then eliminate interest and penalties if we've been ineffective at paying these taxes ourselves, and now we're getting hit with interest charges and penalty charges. It just might be more cost effective for us to outsource it. It also might give us a broader range of benefits that Penmark said it might have some life insurance or better health insurance that our employees can choose from, a little better cafeteria of benefits that they'll be able to choose from. They might be interested in that when coming to work for us. That might be something that would pique their interest. And then finally, I guess this one's minor, but we might be able to free up some computer resources. All right, so there's one problem at the back, and there's two separate parts to it. One is matching, so match the terms on the left with definitions on the right. I'll do the first one. Payroll Service Bureau would be D, an organization that processes payroll and provides other HRM services. All right, and then in the second part, I gave some little vignettes, and I'm requiring you to come up with a control. So the first one, an inadvertent data entry error caused an employee's wage rate to be overstated in the payroll master file. Okay, so here we can use input controls, data security controls. So we can use completeness test and reasonableness test, and then closed loop verification. So put the social security number in, then the name and wage rate should appear automatically. So closed loop verification, reasonableness tests, completeness tests, so we have everything. We can make sure all the boxes are like we did with QuickBooks. Everything's been filled in before we go to the next employee and add his information. All right, and then with the closed loop verification, I put the social security number in, and then the right wage rate and right name should appear. B, a fictitious employee payroll record was added to the payroll master file. So again, separate functions. Someone might be adding his own name twice, or a friend of his. So separate functions only. The HR manager would direct who is allowed to go into that file, master file, and make changes. We use user IDs and passwords to keep everyone else. And then we might also have an HR manager supervise, do a supervisory skill, right, and have reasonable assurance that those should look things over and make sure that the amounts added, people added, or wage rates that were added are correct. During data entry, this is C, the hours worked on employee's time card for one day were accidentally entered as 80 hours instead of 8 hours. We saw this when we did access, that we can force the program to 8 hours. Okay, no one works more than 8 regular hours in one day. That's our limit. So we can put that in there. You work 8 hours. If you have to work more than 8 hours, then you'll need permission or a management override, and someone would have to manually enter, say if you work 2 more hours, and would have to approve that. So it's a way to get extra hours approved. Same thing with overtime. Let's say we pay no overtime, so there won't be any. There'll be 0 hours of overtime that you're allowed to put in unless there's some kind of exception, and then we have to have a management override for that. Computer operator use an online terminal. D, to increase his or her own salary. Again, separate functions, user ID, passwords. Employees should not be able to get into their own master file and change their pay rates. It's a good way for us to go out of business. All right, so that's all I have for this week. So just finish those 2 problems. They're quite short, and then you have one. My educator problem, number 10, which is your last one for the period, for the semester. All right, well, have a good week, and I'll talk to you next week about XBRL.